Hello and welcome to The Exchange, your resource for 1031 market intelligence and education. I'm Tom Wall, partner at Anchor 1031, and this is episode 1 of our 4-part series talking about the structure of a DST. Today we're going to be talking about who can and who cannot invest in a DST and what's allowed and prohibited within the DST structure. By the end of this series, we hope that our investors have a solid understanding of whether this structure is appropriate for them and their family's exchange. To start off, we're going to be discussing who can invest in a DST and other direct private placements, and what it means to be an accredited investor. Only accredited investors and those with accredited entities are allowed to invest in DSTs. So what is an accredited investor? An accredited investor is a person or an entity that the Securities and Exchange Commission allows to invest in certain types of investments. So private equity or hedge funds or other unregistered securities. Accredited investors have to meet specific income, net worth, or professional criteria. The SEC does this because they want to safeguard the public retail investor from participating in investments that might not be appropriate for the average person due to low liquidity or potential risk profile. Now we're going to get into the various nuances of the accreditation process because we want to prepare our investors who are considering direct private placements like the DST, especially ahead of a 1031 exchange. But this is also going to apply to investments in tenants in common or non-traded REITs or other real estate direct private placement. It's really important for investors to discuss their own situation and suitability for these types of investments with their CPA or their tax advisor before they get into a 1031 exchange. So to jump right in, here are some general guidelines to determine if you're an accredited investor as an individual. You only have to meet one of these 3, by the way. So first up are income requirements. An individual must have an income of at least $200,000 or $300,000 if you're combining your income with your spouse. And that has to be for the most 2 recent years with the expectation that you earn the same or higher in the current year. Next is the net worth requirement. So an individual must have a net worth exceeding $1 million, either alone or together with your spouse. However, primary residence is specifically excluded from that calculation, so do not count the house that you live in. And finally, or more rarely, are professional credentials. So certain professional licenses also qualify an individual as an accredited investor. So someone that holds a Series 7, Series 65, or Series 82 license from FINRA could be considered an accredited investor. Individuals who are knowledgeable employees of private funds are also included. This could be executive officers, directors, trustees, general partners, advisory board members, or people who are serving in a similar capacity. So those are the general rules for qualifying as an accredited investor as an individual. And remember, you only have to meet one of those 3 criteria. You don't have to meet all of them. Now, the requirements are different if you plan to invest using an entity such as a corporation, partnership, limited liability company, or a revocable trust. If this is the case, your entity must have total assets in excess of $5 million, and that entity cannot have been formed specifically to acquire the securities. Now, if your entity doesn't have excess of $5 million of total assets, you're not completely out of luck just yet. You can still invest if each of the individual owners of that entity qualify as accredited investors themselves as individuals. And again, this is an either or requirement, so the entity either has to have 5 million of assets or more, or every individual member has to be accredited as an individual. There are some additional nuances and misconceptions that I hear a lot, so just want to make sure you're clear on them when determining your accreditation with a CPA. First is personal versus investment assets. When an individual is adding up their assets, they're not allowed to include personal assets. Like I mentioned, you can't include your personal residence, you can't include a car, but what you can include is investment real estate, or retirement accounts, bank checking accounts, brokerage accounts, anything that you hold that's considered an investment asset. But again, you cannot count your personal residence, even if it's appreciated a lot. They consider it personal versus, an investment asset. Again, can't count your cars, and you can't count a house that maybe your kids are living in for free or a vacation home that you stay in, more than a few days out of the year. But again, make sure you speak with your CPA. They can help you differentiate, which assets you can include and which have to be excluded. Next up is net worth versus total assets. Individual accreditation of 1 million or more is a net amount. So to qualify as an individual, that's got to be your assets minus your liabilities. So an individual should subtract their liabilities when it comes to their mortgages and so forth on a property. But things are different when you're determining the entities accreditation, you need to hit that $5 million mark, but that's gross assets, meaning you don't need to subtract your liabilities. For example, if you have a property worth $5 million and you have a $2 million loan, you still meet the total asset requirement of $5 million. Now, next up is where I see some investors get into trouble or have some confusion, and it's really important to talk to your legal and tax advisors to kind of help work through this if there's any question. So that is going to be entity ownership requirements. So if you're investing using an LLC or an S Corp that does not hold that $5 million of total assets, then every single owner, no matter how minority their stake is going to have to be accredited as an individual. Investors should double check their organizational documents and make sure that all of the owners are verified as accredited, because we've run into trouble with this sometimes, especially when heirs have inherited small portions of an entity, a trust or an LLC, or things have been divided up between family members. Now we can look at some of the common trust complications that we've seen in the accreditation process. While most entities, including revocable trusts that hold assets less than $5 million, can be accredited if all the owners and trustees are accredited as individuals, there are some additional restrictions on irrevocable trusts. Now, irrevocable trusts have to have $5 million in total assets with no exception. It does not matter if each of the owners qualifies as an individual. Investors should double check with their estate attorneys and their CPAs to make sure that their trust and their assets qualify. There have been times that we're told that an investor is using a revocable trust, and we go through the process, we get the documents, and our advisors and analysts review the paperwork and find out that that trust is actually an irrevocable trust and the different qualifications apply. And if it doesn't have $5 million in assets or more, then that investor is now looking at the last minute for another 1031 exchange option. One thing to look out for when determining if your trust is revocable or irrevocable is automatic trust conversion. Some revocable trusts are structured so that they automatically switch over to irrevocable upon the death of one of the trustors. So if a spouse passes away, the trust can switch from revocable to irrevocable. We've seen this happen, and the change in entity disqualified the investor from doing a 1031 exchange into a DST. That's why investors should speak with their trust attorneys to ensure the proper accommodations are in place for such an event. Now, what I mean by that is if you're accredited as a couple and you have a revocable trust, and you go into a DST and one of the spouses passes away, and that trust switches from revocable to irrevocable, and then the DST that you're invested in happens to sell, then you might not be able to do a 1031 exchange into another DST or other direct private placement after the sale. Now, there are exceptions, including the 506B securities exception. So there are certain types of private securities that are called 506Bs, which allow a limited number of non-accredited investors to invest if they meet certain conditions. So one might want to explore those options if it's appropriate after speaking with their CPA or their advisor. That wraps up our time for today. In this episode, we covered the guidelines for determining accredited investor status to help investors navigate the accreditation process. It's an important first step to determine if direct private placements like DSTs or TICs or non-traded REITs are right for you and your family. By getting your ducks in a row ahead of a time-sensitive 1031, you'll potentially save yourself a lot of money and headaches, so please speak to advisors beforehand. Do the research on your entities and your trust. Make sure you qualify for direct private placement before you are under the gun doing your DST, doing your 1031 exchange. That's all for this video. Next time, we're going to be exploring the 7 deadly sins of DSTs and how sponsors structure DSTs to comply with the IRS restrictions. Again, my name is Tom Wall, partner here at Anchor 1031. Thank you so much for checking out Exchange Insights, your resource for 1031 intelligence and education. Sign up on our website, anchor1031.com, for a consultation to discuss your specific situation.